A couple of weeks ago, I updated the visuals of Luigi Circuit from Mario Kart Wii, a somewhat classic Mario Kart track. And this week, I'm here to update an even less classic track, but one that I really like, DK Pass. Okay, I kinda hate it, but it has snow and it reminds me a little bit of DK Summit, a track that I actually do like. But unlike DK Summit, DK Pass was never added into Mario Kart 8. The best looking version of DK Pass is in Mario Kart Tour, a video game for your cell phone. I won't stand for it. DK Pass deserves to look good and exist in a real video game, like Mario Kart 8. And this time, I'm not playing around. I'm gonna race on this thing, because if I can't crash into those stupid snowmen in high resolution, I'm gonna flip out. I started this project off by scouting out DK Pass. I wanted to use anything but the DS version of the map, which has polygons like a plate of nachos. But the Mario Kart 7 model wasn't available on the models resource, where I get pretty much all of my models from. So I checked for perhaps an even better model, the Mario Kart Tour model. But sadly, there weren't any track models here. So I reluctantly returned to the nachos and put off updating the geometry for after I had already sunk several hours into the texturing. Something that I really thanked myself later for. The original DK Pass textures are blurry, crunchy, downright hilarious. But they're also really clever. Many textures look weird when you just preview the image, because they've got all kinds of little tricks and patterns that account for the geometry they're being applied to. This cliff texture has got all of these different angles of snow lines, so that when the cliff meets an angle like this, the cliff texture can remain upright while having the snow spillover match the angle of the terrain. And many textures end up getting combined with other textures into single images. What this means for me is I'm gonna have to make all of my new textures fit these formats, since all of this geometry was unwrapped for these textures. In case you didn't catch that, I'm gonna steal a bunch of Nintendo's textures and line them up in Photoshop so that they work like the original textures. So I started with the road. I ended up getting the road texture from Mario Kart Stadium, the same texture that I used in the last video. Then I used another trick from last video to accomplish the snow on the edges of the track. I brought in a high quality snow texture and cut the shape of the old snow out of the new snow. Then I did some effects to help blend it with the road texture. The main difference between this project and the last is that this time I had some level of confidence when it came to the basics. I knew that this road texture would work, but that didn't stop it from taking an additional 30 minutes of adjusting to make it not look super bad. It was the same situation for replacing the cliffside texture. After around an hour, I ended up with something that looked alright. Then it was the ice bricks. Yeah, that looks okay. Then the signs, and the guardrails, then the lake, then the tunnel, and it all felt a bit wrong. I was spending hours putting stickers on geometry that was ultimately completely unsalvageable. But without access to any other versions of the track, I was going to have to make this geometry work somehow. So I tried a few different strategies. The first strategy was to delete sections of the track and recreate them using the F key, which will fill two vertices with a line or multiple lines with a face. I started on this hill and deleted the horribly spiky terrain. Then I started creating a mesh by connecting parallel vertices. After filling these lines in, it looked just about as awful as the original, and no amount of messing with this was going to help. I also realized that everything from the track to the cliff walls would need to be redone like this, and there was no guarantee that that would yield any good results. So I instead tried something else. I tried using a subdivision surface modifier, but that didn't work either. My last approach would be to create new geometry entirely and stitch it to the track. Yeah, that didn't work at all. I was now realizing I was out of my depth. While wandering around on the models resource to make sure I hadn't missed anything, I found a comment. Every single tour model is ripped. They're all on the MK Tour Discord server. Okay, yeah, it looks like I may have missed something. At this point, I was so done working on that awful DS model, I wasn't even a little bit upset about the idea of having to restart. I was just looking forward to how much better this tour model would be. So I joined the server and asked if I could get a DK Pass 3D model from Mario Kart Tour, which probably made them question the length of the bus that I rode home on. But luckily, they didn't hear my Mario Kart Tour slander that I was spouting mere moments ago, and I was kindly sent a link to a page that contained a plethora of Mario Kart Tour models, including DK Pass. I excitedly downloaded and extracted the files with the energy of 1,000 losers who waste their time gaining access to 3D models from a mobile game. So the energy of about 3 normal people. Then with the energy of 1,000 politicians, I quickly deleted the old files. Then I imported it. And oh my goodness, this looks amazing. Other than the demonic rift opening on the track, this is perfect. Beyond perfect. This is everything I need to work with and more. Finally, this hill looks nice. The way the single color materials are applied in Mario Kart Tour should give me a lot more flexibility with my textures. My new road texture, for example, is just a strip, and this new geometry is great. These cabins look quite a bit better than the original ones. There are a few things I'm not a big fan of, like this tunnel for example. It's clearly a boring concrete tunnel, but those are things I can put up with. This is so much better. The first order of business was to put most of the textures back where they belong. Things got a lot more tedious though when I started texturing this really awesome looking start gate. First, I brought in a few wood textures from Mount Wario. I used the log texture on any cylindrical wood and a board texture for any flat wood. This worked pretty well for the start gate, so I moved on to the next wooden structure, this cabin. This was going to be very simple, which is a scary prospect when you consider how much of it there is to do. For the other little cabin, I ended up just duplicating the one on the right, and the big cabin was the same old process, but big. I also created my own brick texture for these chimneys. I tried using a few Mario Kart 8 brick textures, but they don't quite work, since in this case the geometry defines the bricks, so you need to use a solid color texture rather than trying to fight the geometry bricks with texture bricks. I had a similar predicament with the cliff. It's got this great geometry that I was worried wouldn't work well with the rock texture. But luckily this rock texture meshes pretty well with the rocky geometry. But for the chimney, I just created a brick color in Photoshop, then generated some noise. Then I blurred it a bit and put a different Sherbetland snow overlay on it. I ended up having to mess with the UV unwrapping of the bricks for a while to get something good, and I even changed the color to be a bit darker later on. I also created an emission texture for the windows so that they glow a little bit. And that's mostly it for the cabins. That was too much tediosity. No process does it better than manual UVs. So next I decided to set up the pine trees, which was just about as tedious sadly. I wanted a more realistic look than what I ended up with, but the existing leaf textures, well, they're leaves, not pines. Plus these trees have 3D geometry for the pine needles, which doesn't look great with transparent leaves. So I ended up with something that I think looks nice, albeit a little stylized. Then, because I didn't feel like doing all of that UV work on all the other trees, I just deleted the old ones and duplicated this new one around. Now I'm back to doing some basic texture stuff, working on the fences, the sign walls, and the ice cubes, which led me to the tunnel. I personally like how the original ice tunnel looked, but regardless, I went ahead and threw some concrete textures onto this new tunnel. But I kept getting the feeling that the color scheme of the track was starting to slip away. I'm missing that blue element that was present in this area before. What says fun, magical, wintry adventure like concrete? So I threw out the concrete for some ice. I used a couple of different ice textures to help the geometry have some contrast. And by the end of the texturing, this works so much better. I even ended up creating some faint emission maps for the ice, so that it slightly glows. Then something else caught my eye. Now that everything is starting to look good, these mountains are really starting to suck. I've got to give them a more realistic look by bringing in a texture from Mount Wario. And after getting that texture set up, they look better. But the snow caps are pretty ridiculous, so I tried deleting them. But that's not gonna work. So I tried texturing them, and that sort of works, but after a bunch more messing with UVs, I just said screw it and deleted all of the mountains. I think I can get something better looking without them. I ended up replacing those mountains with more of these surrounding snowy hills. I also duplicated some of the low poly pine trees and scattered them on the distant peaks. And to amp things up even further, I went around attaching normal maps to all of my materials, which gives them a nice 3D detail effect. These normal maps are going to add a level of realism, especially under the proper lighting. This track is really starting to come together, but I'd be remiss if I didn't find a spot for the zero gravity section. So I think I found the perfect spot. I was planning on putting it right here. I don't think zero gravity belongs in this track. Neither does a hang glider section, nor an underwater section. I personally find the tacking on of those sections to older tracks that were designed without them to feel pretty pointless. If anything, they take away from the track. They feel like an interruption. It's like Nintendo has an obligation to put zero-G sections into the tracks because Mario Kart 8 is that game with zero-G sections. But I'm gonna let DK Pass remain a simple, grounded track with no zero gravity. Yeah, screw you, zero gravity fans. I next took on the task of adding some life to the scene, so I brought in some models of the snowmen and constructed the dreaded snowman cartel that posts up on this curve before the finish line. I also lit up the cabins and put some penguins outside with some simple animations. But I still wanted the distance to feel more real, so I started adding more trees on faraway hills. But at some point I realized duplicating these trees so much was both annoying to do and quickly racking up the track's polygon count. So I isolated one of the trees by copying it into a new blend file. Then I pointed the camera straight at the tree, set up a few lights, and made the background transparent. After rendering it out and cropping it in a bit, I had a 4-vertex tree that looks just as good at a distance as the original 135-vertex tree. And the reason I don't have more of these really nice looking trees is because they're nearly 2,000 vertices. or specifically, they're 2,772 triangle polygons. So these 2 triangle image planes are going to end up saving me a lot of performance when I attempt to get this level working in the game. I also got the idea to have little cabins sitting on distant hills, so I made a 2D render for that as well. These distance details really make the track feel right at home in its surroundings. With a little bit of lighting work, this model was ready for renders. But while those are going, we might as well work on getting this track into Mario Kart 8. I didn't even consider attempting this last video. I was already a couple of weeks without an upload, and the idea of learning to mod a Switch or Wii U game was pretty daunting. It took forever for me just to figure out how to mod a DS game, a miscalculation that I had made in the past. But this time, I had finished this track quicker, and I thought that I might as well at least give it a try. I started off by simply looking up how to do so on YouTube, where I found a tutorial playlist by Squadaloo. Immediately, I noticed the first video was over an hour long and that there were 21 of them. But luckily, they aren't all that long, and I really only needed the second video, which is just 46 minutes. After watching it, I felt like it would be surprisingly easy. Still not easy, but more easy than I expected. I decided I was going to do this with the original Mario Kart 8, not Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, since emulating Wii U seems easier than emulating Switch. So with a steadfast, reckless abandon, I pushed through each step of this process, convincing myself that it wouldn't explode at any moment. And in just 3 hours, over a single sitting, I had put together a track that should work.
Oh. I think I know what happened.
Clearly, this isn't right, but it also didn't crash, which is way more than I was anticipating. At first, I thought I had the collision map scaled down, but you can see that I crash into the wall right below where it's supposed to be. This means that the collision map is just in the wrong location. So I brought the collision map into the same blend file as the visual map and lined them up before exporting the collision map separately. What the collision map does is define which parts of the model are meant to be collided with by carts and objects. It also lets you define how different surfaces behave. For example, the road is just set to behave like an asphalt road, while the walls are set to act like a metal wall. Then I have the cliff walls set to a cliff material, so they make a different sound when they're hit. This is also where I can set up this boost ramp to act like a boost ramp, and set up invisible walls on the sides to make sure you don't fly out of bounds. After adjusting the location of the collision map, I was ready to race around this track at last.
Let's see. Huh? Okay. Whoa.
And it mostly works. The lighting is universal and boring, the cabins in the background don't quite work, there aren't any item boxes, and the ramps are anyone's guess. But here's the track in Mario Kart 8. If anybody else wants to play this track through the Cemu emulator, I'll have the files in a link in the description. I'll also try and include enough for anybody who wants to attempt to get this track working and actually look good in the game. If you're having trouble getting these files to work, it's all covered in the later sections of Squadaloo's second tutorial video, which I'll have linked in the description as well. And that's DK Pass revamped. Part of me feels like it could be better, further improved from the MK Tour version of the track. I think the main visual difference between my revamp and the Tour track is the distance details, and I enjoy these snowy hills much more than the mountains that this track has in Tour. The mountains make this track feel closed in and somewhat out of place in its surroundings, but these repeating hills are much more easy on the eyes. They make this place feel like it's simply a single mountain in this wonderful range of gentle snowy peaks. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. I plan on doing more tracks in the future, but do also expect to see some videos on Super Mario 64 or some obscure Wii game, or me complaining about Minecraft or something. Well, I appreciate you watching. I'll see you later. Thanks.